And yeah, that leads us to today's host. This is Tamara Statz, who is the licensed marriage and family therapist at Vibrant Living in Minnesota. Tamara is also an adjunct professor at St. Mary's University, and she's going to chat with us today about being resilient in retirement, things that I think are incredibly important. We talk often about financial resilience for retirement, but I think it's just as important to talk about the mental and physical resilience in retirement as well. So I'm going to pass that off. Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate having you, and I'm going to mute myself and let you take it away.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here with you. Just going to pull up my slides here. Wonderful. Okay, well, nice to meet you, sort of. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Tamara. We're going to talk today about resilience through retirement, define what resilience is, talk about different experiences of the transition to retirement, and some ways that you can build your capacity for resilience. So who am I? Why am I here? So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I am licensed in 4 states. They are listed there. I am in private practice, which is called Vibrant Living. I typically, before the pandemic, had gone into people's homes. My specialty is aging and older adults and their families. And so before the pandemic was going into their homes, and then the pandemic changed everything. But I still go into people's homes as needed, specifically for, mobility issues or transportation issues, trying to break down that barrier. And then I see clients virtually as well as in my office in St. Paul, Minnesota. I have a fellow in thanatology, which means I have expertise in death, dying, and bereavement. And then, as mentioned, I am on adjunct faculty at St. Mary's University, Minnesota, where I will be going to teach in a couple hours, which is why I'm at home. And just my own housekeeping, I have 2 cats and a dog, and statistically, there will be a cat joining me and probably a dog will bark. So these are the hazards of being at home, but I am thankful for it as well. So why talk about retirement? Obviously, for a lot of people, though not all, if we're honest, it's an exciting time. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes retirement is forced. Whether we were forced out of the company we were working for, or it's a health change. Retirement brings about a lot of change. There is actually a high rate of suicide, especially for white men around this age. That tends to be kind of associated with a lost sense of purpose and a decline in productivity, right? I use air quotes because it's a very subjective term. And then there can be some mental health concerns around the retirement time, such as isolation. There can be increased time at home with a spouse, and there's pros and cons to that too. And it's an important transition. I'm going to hide. Sorry, I'm just going to hide the little controls. There we go. Okay, so that's why it's important to talk about retirement, not just as a fun time, but as there's a lot of stuff going on. So what we're going to do today, we're going to discuss resilience and some strategies for cultivating resilience before and throughout retirement, and then discuss some challenges and opportunities of retirement. So just to kind of foundationally, what is resilience? This is an opportunity if you want to engage, you can. I think I designed these thinking we had access to the chat box. I'm not sure if we do, but just consider, even if you can't submit it, just consider, what do you think of when you hear the word resilience? I was just having a conversation with some colleagues kind of around, people assume children are resilient because they bounce back or they've got so much time. The fact is actually resilience is available to everybody, not just children. And sometimes, frankly, we use it to describe children in a way to kind of minimize what they're experiencing and just say oh, they're resilient, they'll bounce back, and dismiss them. But actually, we all have the capacity for resilience, and we all really need to build this muscle. We also all want our experiences validated, but we're not here to talk about kids. So the good news is resilience is available to all. It is not a distinct personality trait that only some people have. It's actually defined as actions, behaviors, and thoughts that individuals at any age can learn and develop. It's like a muscle, but it takes time and intentionality to build it. And so kind of an example of a resilient mindset is seeing retirement as an opportunity instead of a threat. We'll talk more about what that looks like. So what is resilience? Well, it's a unique combination of internal factors and external factors. We're going to talk a bit about what those look like. So an internal factor of resilience is having a positive attitude, having a sense of flexibility, being open to trying new things, trying new experiences, having a sense of optimism. It's also having a sense of adaptability. So being able to stay calm in stressful situations, having an ability to roll with the punches. Usually when I do a presentation on resilience and ask for stuff in the chat, someone at some point says roll with the punches. So I know that's applicable. Exerting control where you can and letting go when you can't. Easier said than done, right? Which is why this is a muscle that we build and not just a skill that we're all born with that we don't have to tend to. It also is effective coping skills. So mindfulness, right? Practicing mindfulness. We hear about this a lot. You've probably had a presentation on it. But really it's about staying in the present moment versus getting kind of pulled into anxieties about the future. A couple of ways that we can do this is by practicing square breathing, which is where we breathe in for 4 counts, hold it for 4 counts, exhale for 4 counts, and hold it for 4 counts. We know from research, breathing changes our brain and it grounds our bodies in the present moment. We know that breathing is an automatic thing that we're doing, but calling attention to it and practicing this actually calms us and changes our brain, which is pretty cool, free, and easy to do. We can do a 5 senses exercise. So looking around the room and naming each sense and something that you see, hear, taste, touch, and smell can help you be more oriented to the space that you're in. So this is a way of building more effective coping skills and building that internal resilience. Another internal quality to build is healthy thinking, is utilizing creativity. Even problem solving involves creativity. I hadn't really thought of myself as a creative person until a conversation I was having a few years ago with a friend of mine who was kind of remarking that, no, you're a creative person. You look at something and you think of what it can become, and you figure out how to get it there. And I had never thought of like brainstorming as an act of creativity. And it has empowered me to see myself as a creative person. Healthy thinking also entails paying attention to negative thought patterns. What rabbit trails do you go down in your head that aren't particularly helpful? There's this saying attributed to no one that I know of, but can be really powerful. Don't believe everything you think. A lot of us have kind of like, we can call it kind of like the voice, the loudspeaker, kind of coming at us, this negative self-talk kind of coming at us of, oh, you're moving slow again today, or whatever it is, like insert, insult here. We don't have to believe that, right? We can set some boundaries around that. And we don't have to believe everything that we think or every anxious thought we have. I say this as a person with anxiety, right? I have to embody this as well. And understanding also that growth is hopeful. I did a presentation on resilience through chronic and terminal illness. And when I had asked about resilience and how you build resilience in the chat, someone had said, I'm planting a garden and watching my vegetables grow gives me hope because growth is hopeful. And I also kind of connect this to like post-traumatic growth, where when you go through something particularly problematic and painful and traumatizing, we know that you can actually grow as a result of that. Now, mind you, I'm not a natural optimist, and I'm not saying any of this with rose-colored glasses, right? Like I acknowledge that a variety of experiences are very painful and very difficult, and it can be really hard to think with creativity and think positively. And so trying to be in the midst of being realistic and hopeful and realistic, right? Kind of like, how can we be both? External factors, thinking about how we choose to spend our days, how we choose to spend our time. right? As we'll talk about later, when we retire, we oftentimes, though not always, have the ability to make different choices about how we spend our time. And so really kind of looking at that from a place of empowerment, of a place of active engagement, choosing to come to these wonderful events that you guys have. It's amazing. I am thinking like, I want to attend that. That sounds like something that could be helpful for me and my clients, right? And so like being able to make use of the opportunities you have in front of you. Thinking about what brings you a sense of purpose, right? Being involved in your neighborhood, being involved with your grandchildren, right? Your nieces and nephews, whatever, like the things we choose to engage in. Also understanding it's okay to grieve what you've lost and what's changed. I had a client with Parkinson's who used to love to golf and was really looking forward to golfing a lot in his retirement, but his Parkinson's made it that he couldn't. And so a fair amount of our time together in therapy was spent talking about grieving the changes in his body and how that affected his hobbies and his interests. And so again, it's kind of trying to be in that place of making choices where you can, and also holding space for grieving where you've lost the ability to do things that you've enjoyed. And then also when we think about engagement, making goals. If you have a neighborhood association saying, I think I want to run for the board. I want to get involved in that fundraiser we have coming up. I want to take up a leadership role in the community cleanup, right? Like thinking about ways that you can have active engagement can kind of combat some of that lost sense of productivity. Maintaining relationships, super important at any age, right? But this can combat isolation. So having a strong support system, whatever that means to you, prioritizing your relationships, whether that be with family or friends or former colleagues or your neighborhood, right? Connecting with people who understand you and what you're experiencing that you can trust. These types of communities that you have right here with PSS, I can remember acronyms, is so powerful and so important, right? So being surrounded by people who understand you and what you're going through. We can feel really like choosing to isolate during times of stress and pain. It's important to accept help and support. So it's important to really tune into yourself. I also think it's important to kind of know what works for you. And so if you are an introvert, which I understand I am one as well, and you are a person who just likes to turn inward to process things, that's okay too, right? Like you don't have to suddenly become an extrovert because you have more time on your hands. That's not what that's not what you want to do. You don't need to change who you are. And it's not expected and you're not really healthy either, right? So, but paying attention to, am I isolating myself? Am I withdrawing more than I normally would to handle a stressful situation? Maybe joining a support group or starting a support group, right? The stigma of mental health is coming down. The stigma of attending to your mental health and getting services, right? Seeking help is coming down. And I'm thankful for that because we all have mental health concerns of varying degrees that we need to tend to. Something that worked really well for a client of mine after her husband had died from, I think he had Lewy body dementia in particular, reasonable amount of time after her loss. I think they had required it to be at least a year. She started leading a support group with the Alzheimer's Association and found a lot of purpose in that, right? She was able to connect with a support system. She was able to provide support, which can be really powerful as well. And being able to be around people who understood. So join one as a recipient, join one as a, start one as a leader too. Making uses of the resources available in your community, right? This is an external factor. So thinking about what's available in your community. Are you up to date on your health care? Are you near the resources that you need for your health care? Are you managing your chronic illnesses? Are you making use of the specialists that are in your area that you have access to? Are you preparing and planning ahead for what's to come? We age, right? Like that's a fact. That is a fact, a biological fact of life. That is a fact. And so planning ahead for decisions you might have to make or the care that you might need in the future. again, consider, don't have to type, like, what have you done to cultivate resilience as you age? Are you joining a fitness group? Are you journaling? Are you reflecting on sense of purpose, right? There are active ways that you can take part in this experience. Some pre-retirement considerations. So we're going to talk about pre-retirement and kind of like during retirement. Thinking about the location where you want to retire. Will your retirement income be able to sustain your current living situation and lifestyle? Planning ahead. Can your current home accommodate the changing needs as you age? Do you know you have Parkinson's and you're concerned about the stairs in your house? Do you need to move to a single level living? Considering affordability, safety, stability, having access to your medical providers or dentists, and then transportation options. What are the logistical things that can help you not be isolated throughout this experience? Can it meet your physical, emotional, social, and medical needs? Do you need to consider a move into a CCRC or a different residential long-term care, such as assisted living? Those types of moves can bring enhanced independence, increased health, reduced isolation. It also can bring a lot of grief, right? Like there's two sides. Well, there's probably multiple sides to all of these. It's a die, right? It's 6 sides. These moves require a lot of preparation, time, and in financial investment, right? Regardless of the type of move you're going to make, you'd have, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. So resilience in this way looks like adaptability, flexibility, and really creative problem solving, figuring out, is what I have right now going to meet my needs down the road? Is there anything we can do to prepare it so that it can? Thinking about finances. Only about half of households approaching retirement age, as of this article in 2021, have any retirement savings. Yikes, right? So how are you financially preparing? Meeting, if you are currently employed, like meeting with your HR department or your financial planner, both ideally, right? To ensure that the process of transitioning to either, a varied or reduced income will still meet your needs. My parents retired a little over a year ago in their 60s and 70s. And my mom has had a heck of a time navigating her retirement pension. And it was pretty stressful, even though she was working with HR. So this isn't I'm going to give my month's notice and it'll all figure it out. This is a year and a half of dealing with that for her. So kind of understanding it's a process. Considering meeting with a financial planner who can help provide some insight and best practices in late life. It is a valuable, cost-effective, underutilized resource. And so making use of the support around you from professionals. And then also when you're thinking of financing, considering, do you want to work part-time, either for financial reasons or health-related reasons, because you need to maintain some quality of life, or because you have a specific skill or goal that you want to keep up? I have a colleague that I collaborate with. We were just talking yesterday. She's 75. She's a PhD in laboratory microbiology, and she's struggling because she's trying to find meaningful ways to engage with laboratory science in 2023, which she says has changed so much from when she was trained. But she doesn't want to just go work in a daycare or volunteer at a senior center. She wants to engage in a lab and is really having a hard time finding a way to maintain those skills and keep up those interests. When you're thinking about finances, exploring your relationship to money in general, right? Like, what are your saving and spending habits up to this point? Do you have any feelings about dipping into your savings to maintain your current lifestyle? Do you feel guilt, right? Do you have savings to dip into? Having these important conversations with your spouse, partner, adult children, a counselor, a financial planner, right? Like having kind of these well-rounded conversations with the people that it impacts. I think also an important pre-retirement element is choice, right? I talked about this at the beginning of our conversation about can be a really exciting time, can also be a really challenging, problematic time for people too, depending on their ability to make choice about this decision. So, in any decision, human beings value the ability to be active participants in decision making and having choice in their lives. We like to be in control. That's not necessarily a dirty word. A lot of times control is like, oh, she's controlling. It's like, well, we all try to be, actually, because we like to be in the driver's seat of our lives. And it's important to acknowledge COVID impacted the ability to choose to retire versus forced retirement, or closing of a family business, right? Or retiring sooner than you thought you would. The US experienced more than 2.5 million excess retirements due to the pandemic. And this is a 2021 statistic. It's early in 2023, so it takes a while for statistics to come out, right? So, but add another year to that, what are the numbers? So excess retirements is the difference between the predicted retirements based on age and the number of actual retirements that occurred. So this was not a normative experience, right? This was something that was due to other reasons. Elements of choice include freedom, right? Some folks in an article describe their sudden and unchosen exit from the workforce as difficult, from losing the freedom to work, rather than the assumption that individuals who retire are seeking the freedom from work, right? There can be this perception. I'm sure no one in this group feels this way, right? But our communities sometimes feel like, oh, wow, you don't have to work anymore. What freedom from working? Not everyone feels that way. Sometimes it's losing the freedom to work, because work was an area of purpose, which work was an area of joy, right? Of fulfillment. So freedom kind of cuts both ways in that way. Resilience, when it comes to choice, really is the ability to tolerate the discomfort and anxiety, acknowledging the loss, the impact on your life, and really seeing this challenge as an opportunity. It's a shift in mindset, right? Erik Erikson, who was a brilliant developmental psychologist, the Erikson stages of development, wrote in 1986, right? From spending years doing what you need to now doing what you want to, including things maybe you couldn't previously do due to your work demands, right? Seeing it as an opportunity. Really, the role of choice in this decision to retire, in their study of resilience, adversity, and aging, they found that a sense of control over the transition of retirement was a major theme in resilient outcomes. Acknowledging choosing between options can be stressful, right? Even still having the ability to choose can feel stressful. It can be challenging to positively shape the remainder of our lives and continue to find meaning despite not working. And I think the important thing is that resilience in decision-making is not a one-time thing. It involves the ability to adjust as needed along the way. When it comes to resilience and choice, really, it's about embracing the connection to hopes, dreams, plans, inner thoughts and values, trusting that you will have made positive choices in the past and that you'll continue to make positive choices during this transition, right? Leaning on the good choices that you've made throughout your life. If you are someone who's made good decisions, whatever that means, it's very subjective, you're probably going to continue to make good choices. So some strategies for cultivating resilience through retirement. Prepare, right? When it comes to decisions, documents, talking to your HR person, talking to a financial planner, maintaining care for your physical and mental health, right? Building your support system like we talked about, acknowledging it might include adult children, neighbors, friends, former coworkers, nieces, nephews, grandchildren. It might also include paid support, whether that be a housekeeper or someone to come in and help mow the lawn, right? Different ways to prepare for your time to be changing or your needs to be changing. Get your ducks in a row, right? Work on your documents with your HR planner, your financial planner. Work on your estate planning, so important. It can feel like, isn't there something more positive to talk about? We don't want to talk about death, right? I hate to break it to you, we're all dying, we're all going to die. And so you can plan your estate, or it can be up for grabs with probate and like it can go a lot of different ways, right? I am not an estate attorney, but I have brilliant colleagues who are, and I lean on them and I refer to them. But planning ahead Planning ahead for the future care you want as well. Planning ahead of location. Do you want to age in place? Do you want to try to stay in the place where you're currently living? What changes would need to happen to your house to do that? Is it conducive to doing that? Remembering you are and can be resilient. You likely already possess resilient qualities. You've made it this far, right? You can continue to grow and cultivate resilience. It is a muscle. I really hope that you hear this message as hopeful, because it is, right? This is something that you can grow and cultivate. There are ways to prepare and maintain your well-being. So thinking of physical and mental and emotional well-being. Physical well-being, so maintaining your physical health, attending to your preventive health care visits, regular screenings, having an awareness of your family history and medical issues, preparing for future healthcare expenses can take the pressure off of already stressful situations, right? Taking care of your physical health when you're in the midst of a health crisis is stressful enough, having to make decisions, let alone being stressed about where the finances are going to come from to pay for that care. Resilience in this way looks like managing your chronic health conditions, planning ahead for end-of-life choices such as life-sustaining measures, resuscitation, intubation, dialysis, right? Having an advanced care plan on file with your doctor, talk about it with your family, planning for a funeral. That is also another future, essentially, healthcare expense. Maintaining regular healthy living habits. I always have people ask me, like, what can I do to stave off dementia? Because I'm really afraid of it happening. It's the boring things we should all already be doing. Diet, sleep, exercise, right? All of the things we should be doing at any age. Preparing your emotional well-being and maintaining that sense of connection for socialization, support, that builds resilience. Thinking about how changing routines might affect your relationship with your spouse or partner. What does that mean for your increased time together? Tongue in cheek, pros and cons, right? It can be challenging to navigate between dependence and interdependence with somebody that maybe you've spent decades not seeing all day, every day, because you both have been going to work. And so it can bring a changing dynamic that can, a challenging dynamic that can be heightened during retirement. So having these proactive conversations can lay a foundation for effective community support and having a mutually satisfying connection with your partner or your spouse. Remembering those relationships with coworkers, colleagues, maybe former customers could transition more to friendships. I have a client in his 90s who has maintained friendships for 30 years since he stopped working with former customers. He was a salesman and he has lunch with these customers monthly. And it's a huge part of his source of support and connection. Our ongoing connections for emotional well-being become fostered through a mutual interest in each other, right? As individuals, rather than being focused on work-oriented goals. Resilience in this way looks like seeking out opportunities in your community, your neighborhood association, or other groups that are united around a shared cause. Habitat for Humanity, right? Other ways for getting involved. During retirement considerations. Emotions. There are some emotions that are expected and some that might come up as a surprise. It can be a time of a lot of excitement, a lot of satisfaction after decades of working. You might have a sense of pride, gratitude, happiness, optimism. There can be a sense of relief, especially if you had work situations that were stressful or caused health effects that were negative. In this way, retirement can actually bring about recovery for you. There might be some fear, disappointment, loneliness, frustration, especially if retirement doesn't go according to plan. I've had clients who, retire and then are faced with a devastating diagnosis, or their spouse is faced with a devastating diagnosis, and they say, these are supposed to be the golden years. We wanted to go on cruises. We wanted to travel, right? There's these curveballs that can happen that can lead to a lot of sadness. Resilience when it comes to emotions really is noticing, acknowledging, honoring, experiencing, and moving through our emotions, letting them move through our bodies, including positive emotions. This is where the importance of those supportive communities come in to support our emotional and practical needs. There can be a sense of grief, which might be a surprising part for you of the retirement transition. There's a lost sense of productivity, connection, purpose, structure to your day. There can be a lost sense of identity. Who am I now that I'm not working? You might experience the death of a spouse or friends during this time, which can further compound your grief as well. Resilience in this way is not just identifying being productive as the main source of meaning. So moving, like Erickson said, from doing to being, exploring thoughts about your possible self, creating a life that wasn't possible when you were working, looking at it through I always phrases. I've always gotten it done, right? I've always made good choices. Continuity of your identity, right? Throughout your lifetime doesn't have to be tied to production or work identity. I've always made good choices with my money. I'm going to continue to do that, right? There might be a sense of ambiguous loss. An ambiguous loss is something that's like hard to explain, can feel ambiguous, right? Like confusing, gray, open-ended. Ambiguous loss in this experience of retirement can be kind of like feeling like you lost yourself when you stop working, yet you're still feeling capable of doing the same work. You're choosing not to, right? I could keep working, but I am choosing not to, and I'm having a hard time that I'm choosing not to, but I also don't want to keep working, right? Like it can sound kind of like a confusing catch. It can feel like two emotions are in conflict. I'm feeling relief and also sadness. It can feel confusing. Grief during retirement can be a disenfranchised loss. That's a loss that's not socially acknowledged or validated. That's when communities and people around us are just like, oh, you must just be having the time of your life now that you're retired. Well, you might or may not be, right? Like depending on a lot of factors, you might or may not be. And so when those around us are thinking retirement's the golden years and that's all it ever is, and wow, it must be so great, it can feel pretty isolating and alone when that's the message that we're getting when we're actually not feeling that way. So you might feel disappointed, frustrated, lonely when society tells you that you should be feeling relaxed, free, relieved because you're no longer working. You might feel an expectation that retirement should be bliss, but you might experience feeling isolated or bored. And that doesn't fit the cultural narrative, right? That might contribute to a feeling of loss that peers might not understand or acknowledge if their retirement experience is very different. My dad's experience of retirement, bliss. He has a workshop, he's doing projects, he was just like, great, now I have time to do everything I've wanted to do. My mom's experience of retirement was just like, she's a retired nurse. Nobody needs me. What am I doing? I can't just read all day. And so now she volunteers with Lutheran Social Services and a company in Minnesota. She is a senior companion for older adults. Her love was older adults when she was a nurse, which shout out to mom is what gave me my interest in working with older adults. And so figuring out kind of like what is your sense of loss here? What is your sense of gain? Changing routine. There can be a loss of structure to your days, right? We think about this in terms of internal and external locus of control. So pre-retirement, this external locus of control, work and school schedules dictated when we get out of bed, when we have time for hobbies, when we have lunch. Retirement time can bring in an internal locus of control where we get to choose. We have to self-generate, though, our parameters around how we spend our time, our energy, how we spend our days, right? Now the pressure's on us to figure out what time do we get up in the morning? Do I set an alarm, right? Do I take a shower and put on fresh clothes every day, right? So building a sense of routine, because this loss of routine can bring a sense of disorientation as well as opportunity, right? You might not have to set your alarm anymore for 6 a.m. You can send it for 7:30 if you like setting an alarm, or if you're like me, I hate setting alarms. I want to wake up to the sun, right? And so figuring out what kind of structure you want to have in your days. keeping in mind, rigid routines that lack this autonomy or flexibility can really determine how adverse this experience is, right? And so figuring out resilience looks like setting daily or weekly goals, building a sense of accomplishment, having a sense of flexibility, adaptability, flexible problem solving, seeing this lack of structure as an opportunity rather than a threat, because we can now creatively plan to how to use our time. You know, no one's going to hand us a blueprint for how we need to spend our days. We get to choose now. No pressure or anything, right? But you get to choose. Coping is a very important aspect of resilience. There are two types of coping defined by these researchers: assimilative coping, which is kind of those hands-on activities to prevent or alleviate our age-related losses, and then accommodative, which is adjusting and readjusting one's personal goals and ambitions. It's really about inhabiting both. Understanding your sense of mortality might come into play here. Oh, the slide is a little broken. Having a sense of limited time left can coincide with retirement, right? So there can feel like there's a pressure to make the most of our time left. We might have to renegotiate our relationship with time, making the most of what we do have. You can do a life review. That's an actual exercise you can do to reflect on your past accomplishments and setting goals for how you want to spend your time in the future. Resilience, when it comes to mortality, popping up here might mean engaging with leaving a legacy by doing generative tasks, establishing a college fund for a grandchild, right? Building a park in your neighborhood. It includes seeing things as they are and seeing things as they could be, even after you've died, is a resilient approach. It comes in acknowledging your mortality and finding a purpose and meaning in the impact that you leave, right? So that kind of ongoing connection of your impact can live on after you are gone. Mortality, finding joy in a dream come true, just as in a dream coming true, right? So having a sense of peace and satisfaction as you reflect back on your life can be helpful while living fully in the present and anticipating the decreasing time ahead, right? So it's all of the above. I'm right on time. Some future areas of research that needs to be conducted is really looking at the impact of systemic inequity and institutionalized racism on the ability to retire, or the experience of retirement for BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, individuals who might have limited access to healthcare or healthy community due to historic racism and redlining practices. More research needs to be done on the unique experiences of LGBTQ+ retirees, differences between urban and rural retirees, right? Very different resources and access, and really overall more research based on the input and experiences of people other than affluent, educated, primarily white samples, right? The information is really skewed by the sample. And so broadening our research based on who actually lives in the US. In conclusion, retirement can be a time of tremendous happiness, satisfaction, relief, disappointment, frustration, and many things in between. Individuals, including you and me, have capacity for a tremendous capacity of resilience. And resilience is a process, a tool, an ability that can be learned and enhanced across the lifespan. Resilient individuals before and during the retirement transition display adaptability, flexibility, and creativity in the face of inevitable change and necessary adjustments to create the ideal life. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I took so many notes.
I'm glad.
Because I think I just love that there's a lot here that we can kind of dig into. We have a couple questions, which I'll get to in just a second. Feel free, if you haven't written a question and you have one, pop it in. We'll get to all of them. But I think there's something really important about the idea of kind of being prepared in a way. And it's never too late necessarily to kind of work through to find that resilience. But I think being prepared, maybe even finding those other like sense of purposes now as well before you retire, so that when you do retire, you're not just kind of, left with nothing. But I think, just like you said, I think one of the most important things someone told me is that two feelings can be true at once. And I think having that in your presentation about, you might be feeling blissful but then also lonely, or you're grieving this whole section of your life but then also excited to move on. Both things can be true at once. I think that's important info to have at all times. So let me just get to the first question here. How do you suggest someone who may be more timid or feels shameful about feeling lonely to then start reaching out for help?
Timid or shameful about being lonely? Well, I think as with most things, acknowledging that you feel that way, right? And it's an understandable way to feel. You maybe haven't had to rely on community in the same way as you might in this transition of time. I would start small. I would, kind of tune into yourself and what works for you, which is going to be different than what works for me, what works for Sarah or anyone else here or anywhere else on the planet, right? Like what works for you. So maybe it's not about going to a community meeting where there's 25 new neighbors to meet. Maybe it's connecting with one person that you know from church who happens to also like knitting. I love knitting and cross stitch, right? So like maybe someone with a shared hobby that you can start small, that you don't have to just go from being, the words you used were shy and timid. I almost made a new word. So you don't have to go from being shy to suddenly being like the life of the party. Having realistic expectations for yourself, not pressuring yourself to be someone that you're not, and understanding at the same time, right, this duality, that connection is so important. And so I guess kind of like off the top of my head, knowing nothing about you personally, I would just start small and also like give yourself the time to adjust, that it might take time to build a friendship. It takes time to build friendships at any age, but especially if you're a person who that hasn't been something that you've wanted to do a ton, which is fine. It can give yourself some grace that it might take some time to build that connection. It takes some vulnerability to build connection and friendships. And so understanding it might take a couple tries, a couple different people to try before you form a strong friendship. But you have every right to discern whether or not the connection is quality, whatever that means to you. So I guess my two thoughts would be to start slow and start small, and find, a commonality with somebody and then kind of build from there.
Yeah, I think that's important too. And I know you said this in your presentation, but just to kind of circle back to it, that you don't have to, especially if you're more of an introverted person, you don't have to necessarily join this big community program, because like you don't have to go from 0 to 60. Like you said, you can find a few people in your kind of small circle to connect with first. And then if you want to go bigger, you can, but you don't have to. It's not something you necessarily have to do. It's just another resource that's available to you.
Yeah, I have an example of that. So I work with a lot of people who are aging, but also adult children that are caring for a parent who's aging. And I had a gal who said, well, now that my dad moved into the assisted living, all he does is sit in his apartment and read the newspaper. I go, okay, this is all done with utmost respect, right? It might sound a little snarky what I'm about to say, or maybe it won't because you're in New York. I'm in Minnesota and they're used to passive aggression. I am born and raised in Minnesota. I'm not passively aggressive. I did not get that gene. And so I stick out here in Minnesota. And so anyway, so the adult daughter says, this is all he's doing now. And I say, okay. I as a person like to know kind of like, well, what's happened in the past, right? That's helpful to kind of inform like, okay, what's going on now? So I said, okay, well, what did he do before he moved? Well, he sat in his condo and really read the newspaper. And I go, okay, so is this a problem? Is this a problem? And we sussed out it isn't, right? It was a problem for her. But oftentimes, and this is a whole other like multi-hour conversation about adult children caregiving for us. And there's a squeak in my voice because like pros and cons, right? Both. But what can happen sometimes is adult children now have a window into their parents' lives. And she didn't know, or didn't, wasn't on her radar, like, oh yeah, dad just likes to stay in his apartment, read the newspaper. Well, suddenly now that she has some control in his life, now it's a problem. It's not really a problem, right? I said, we can't expect your dad to become an extrovert. That's not right. Just because all of these activities are happening in his building, it's not suddenly he's going to want to do all of them, right? He might want to do one or two, but it also doesn't mean that he's isolating himself, right? So I think it's really important. And as I train therapists who are becoming interested in working with older adults, it's really important that we not pathologize being an introvert, because our society can do that enough. We don't need to add to it. But introversion is not is not an illness, right? Isolation isn't helpful, but there's a difference between the two, and I think there's some nuance there. Anyway, I have stories for everything.
No, I think that's great. And I think you had mentioned also that resilience doesn't always mean movement. Like, it doesn't always mean you have to be productive in the way that someone else might think is productive. And I know both my parents are retired as well, and their retirements are so different, and they're not what I expected for either of them as well. And so it's just one of those things that you kind of, I think, like you said, it's nuanced, and just taking the time to understand that one person's retirement will look different than somebody else's. And as long as, like you said, they're not isolating themselves, it doesn't always have to mean movement or doing anything specific.
Give yourself permission for your retirement to look however you want it to. It doesn't have to look like your friends.
Exactly. And actually, leading into our next question, how can someone start to notice that they're having negative feelings about retirement? So almost, I imagine something like isolation, noticing that they are isolating themselves. And they said sometimes it can be hard to tell how you're handling something while you're in it, which I agree.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. It can be hard to tell how you're handling something when you're in it. The forest and the trees, right? Like, oh my gosh. So I think it is kind of, tuning into yourself. This might be more tuning into yourself than you've ever done, because you're going through a major life transition, because all of your adult life you've been working. And so tuning into yourself, looking at, have your eating habits changed? Are you eating more or less than you used to? Have your sleeping habits changed more or less than you used to? Have you used to be, I can find the words, have you used to be an outgoing extroverted person, and now you're finding yourself pulling back? Kind of like, what's different? What are you noticing that's different? Sometimes it takes a while to go, oh, something's different, right? For any of us at any age, it takes a while to look back and go like, oh, I've been doing that for a while. That's different for me. Sometimes it's people in our lives reflecting to us, is everything okay? You haven't come to church in 6 weeks, right? So sometimes it's other people in our lives saying like, is everything all right? Sometimes the answer is yes, everything's all right. But sometimes we need to go, oh, hadn't noticed that I wasn't really talking in our conversations at our Saturday coffee. So I think it's a blend between kind of tuning into yourself, which might be journaling your emotions that day. There's a really wonderful tool that I just drone on and on about. It's called the feelings wheel. I didn't include it today, but if you Google the feelings wheel, there's a lot of different versions of it. But really, ultimately, what you do is you start at the center, which has like happy, anger, sad, something else, like the basic 5 emotions or whatever. And then you kind of like, you work your way out in concentric circles, and it makes them more complex. And it can help you identify the actual complexities of what you're feeling, right? Of just like, oh, I'm feeling afraid. Oh, actually I'm feeling shocked, right? Like, it can help you identify more complex emotions. So I think kind of like enhancing your emotional vocabulary, and being able to tune in, like, what am I feeling right now? I have folks who use the feelings wheel. I've had a gal who's just like, I love it so much. I printed it out. I set it on the countertop. So now when my husband and I are having a conversation, I'm like, where's it on the wheel? Where are you on the wheel? So use it as you will, but it's a great tool for us to tune into ourselves, to go like, this is different for me. Different doesn't always equal bad, right? Doesn't always equal bad, but go, okay, it's different for me. How do I feel about it? Feel okay. All right. right? I became more introverted during the pandemic. I'm an introvert, but I became more introverted during the pandemic. I'm okay with it because my life before the pandemic was way too busy and it was just exhausting. And so I have kept some of those changes. Was it a notable change? Yes. Was it bad according to my scales? No. It's actually really helpful. And so understanding that what looks helpful or not for you or healthy or not for you is going to look different than for someone else. So you might have someone in your life who reflects and says like, oh, you haven't been talking much. Yeah, I know. I've really been enjoying listening. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, kind of expanding your emotional vocabulary, because oftentimes, I mean, speaking from personal experience, sometimes you think an emotion is one thing, and then if you sit with it, like you said, in mindfulness or meditation, you realize that, look, oh, I'm not actually angry, I'm fearful, or I'm not
Yes.
actually this, I'm bored. It's sometimes you don't, like, when you kind of sit with it a little bit more and kind of expand the emotional vocabulary, you start to understand your feelings even a little bit more.
Yes.
Totally. That being said, you kind of touched on this with adult children, but also I know we have some caregivers in the audience as well. How would you suggest, just generally speaking, that someone can approach a retiree who they feel might be having a negative impact to it? How do you suggest they approach it with kind of awareness and kindness, but then also, trying to help them? Is there, I know it's a little bit of a balance, but anything that you can recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a sense of curiosity. And also, I mean, I appreciate the question and also an openness that you might be wrong, that maybe there isn't something negative going on, right? So like all of the nuances of like, it's their situation, just as we don't want ours judged. They don't probably want theirs judged. And obviously things can go wrong. And so I think a sense of curiosity, I think something that works well can be asking, not just like, how are you doing? But just like, I've noticed, I've noticed you haven't come to our coffee hour on Saturdays. Is everything okay? And then trusting their answer, right? Because they have every right to open up to you or not. And you asking the question might plant a seed. And so to also just never underestimate the seeds that you can plant just by a gentle, curious question. But that isn't saying like, John, you haven't come on Saturday. I'm so worried about you. You're isolating yourself, right? Okay, that's a lot of assumptions we're making. That's a lot of judgment we're making. John might not be isolating himself. He might actually have a new hobby that he really enjoys. Maybe he took up knitting, right? He might have a hobby he really enjoys. And so paying attention to, okay, I feel the sense of concern for someone. Where's it coming up for me? Like, where's that coming from? And what do I know? What do I not know? Am I making a judgment call here? And if you assess like it's just genuine curiosity and care, being curious for, here's what I've noticed, like, is everything okay? Yeah, everything's fine. I've just been, spending more time at home. Believe him, right? Believe his answer. You don't have to say like, oh, are you sure about that? Because you used to, right? Like we don't need to like push. We can respect John's boundary in his answer and trust that he is an adult and he gave us an answer. And so, I think if you still notice it happening in 6 months, bring it up again, right? Like I've noticed this. Are you still doing okay? Yep. Right. So like I think there's a sense of like paying attention to where the question is coming from for us or where the concern is coming from for us. Are we making any assumptions? Are we making any judgment calls? And then just having that really like compassionate curiosity, and not putting our desires on them, right? My dad's just reading the newspaper. Oh my gosh, it's a problem. Well, maybe for you, it's not for him, right? And so kind of understanding like maybe we wouldn't want the lifestyle that this person has, but it's not really about what I want. And then believing their answer when they respond to us. And then if they say like, actually, I have been really down. Oh, I'd love to support you. The next question is usually like, let me know how. Well, people usually, if they're struggling, they don't have an answer to that because they're struggling. And so like, I'll bring you a couple meals. I'll come mow your lawn, right? Like if they do actually say like, I'm having a hard time, I'd love to sit down and help you find a therapist. I'd love to get you connected with this community group that I'm in. Would you like to come? right? And so offering tangible ways to be useful can be helpful too, if somebody does say, actually, this has been really hard.
Yeah, and I love that coming at it from a compassionate curiosity. I think again, from personal experience, I think there's a lot of fear that, like, you don't want your parent to feel lonely, isolated, bored, all those things. So you might be projecting those. But I think understanding that one, every individual is different, their retirement looks different, and you can always ask the questions, but coming at it from a curiosity standpoint and not I need to fix this standpoint. I think that's a really important distinction for
Yes.
adult children, caregivers, things like that, or
Yes.
even spouses. I
Yeah.
think that's the same
Friends,
for
anyone, right?
yeah.
Pastors, whomever, right? Like, I say church because church is important to a variety of people, right? But I think anyone reflecting on, like, someone else I'm assessing is something is going wrong. Okay, what else going on there? I love that. It's not something I necessarily need to fix. Can I be curious?
Right. I love that. Well, I think that's a great place to end. I don't think we have any more questions. I did want to say you mentioned mindfulness, meditation, and also planning for your future in terms of like understanding trust. We do have some events, not to plug, but we do have some events coming up with both. So that kind of idea of planning in advance, being aware of those tools that you can use. We have a few of those here, but then also check with your own communities and families and friends and things as well to kind of find those resources. And we're just really, really grateful that you were here to give us this great kind of presentation. Your info's here if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out to Tamara. And so we just really appreciate you spending the time with us and sharing your knowledge. Very grateful. And thank you everyone for coming today. And we'll see you for later events this week.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
everyone for
Bye.
coming.